You wanted me to limit it to 2 hours, is that right, Nathan? No, I'll try and keep it within reason so there's plenty of time for discussion. Nathan was too modest to say much about the conference that he is organising, but it has a very interesting theme, and forgive me if I just read out part of how he frames the task of the conference. Individual autocrats are often blamed for autocracy. But how have peoples facilitated dictatorships, or indeed democracies, in recent national histories? What circumstances of opportunity or grievance explain the success of strongmen and their repression of democracy? The conference will examine the historical role over the course of past several decades or more that a country's people have played, collectively and aggregately, in movements toward or away from democracy and autocracy. So I will take what I regard as the first question in all of that, as being, how have peoples facilitated dictatorships or democracies in recent national histories? And the answer, which I will try and summarize briefly at the end, is inevitably more complicated than most theories about it. And let me just say right at the beginning and loud and clear that to suggest that people themselves sometimes play a part in the emergence of an autocracy, as also sometimes of a democracy, doesn't necessarily mean attaching personal blame to them. The game, the enterprise which we've undertaken isn't necessarily about attributing blame, but it is about understanding what are the causes of certain autocratic regimes, and why is it that the widespread hopes after the end of the Cold War that we were entering a new world where there was only one system of constitutional democracy, liberal democracy, that would triumph everywhere. A theory, of course, particularly espoused by Francis Fukuyama, but espoused much more generally. Why is it that life has proved to be much more complicated than that theory? Now, before I get into the case of the Arab Spring, I must make some preliminary observations about 4 points that I think are essential to the subject that we are embarking upon. And one is that one of the most interesting theories in relation to this whole question of whether populations have some involvement in creating the conditions for autocracy, one of the most interesting theories is a very old one, written by a French aristocrat at the age of 18, Etienne de la Boétie, in the 16th century. And he really invented what has become called the theory of voluntary servitude. And he wrote in this memorable essay, "I should like merely to understand how it happens that so many men, so many villages, so many cities, so many nations sometimes suffer under a single tyrant who has no other power than the power they give him." That notion that power depends upon pillars of support, and those pillars of support are provided by the population, that notion is absolutely central to his thinking. And yet, it was a problematic essay. He didn't publish it in his own lifetime. And when his friend and literary executor, the famous essayist Montaigne, considered it for publication in Etienne de la Boétie's writings, he decided in the end not to include it. Why? It's because this is an incredibly sensitive subject. And we will find out in the next few days it's a sensitive subject. And in particular, he was nervous about publishing it because there had been some pirate editions of it, which had all been published by Protestants who were campaigning against particular Catholic rulers. And so an idea which appeared on the face of it to be neutral, a general statement about humans supporting tyranny, had come to be associated with taking sides in the ongoing religious wars of the 17th century. So already then we have a sense of the extreme sensitivity. But there's another problem with de la Boétie's essay, which needs to be thought about. And that is, are the dynamics whereby populations support tyrants not a bit more complicated than he implied? Do they not involve drawing lessons from attempts at rebellion or self-rule? Is the responsibility not more divided than is implied in his theories? The second general issue I want to consider before getting on to the Arab Spring is something I've been thinking and writing a lot about lately. The idea of history as consisting quite largely of a continuous struggle going through many phases between dictatorship and democracy. That's famously found one variant in what is called the Whig interpretation of history in the United Kingdom, and sometimes more generally, which sees history as an ever-rolling advance of institutions, of democratic rights, and which sees dictatorship as essentially belonging in the dustbin of history. And that view has been very influential in the post-Cold War period. Now, there's a lot of criticisms one can make of that view of world history as democracy v dictatorship. But let me just mention one that has long been recognized and that I think is critically important and is relevant to what I'm going to say about the Arab Spring. And that is that it has long been understood that there were some societies where democracy would be very difficult to introduce because they were so divided. They had histories of civil conflict between different sectors of the population, different perceptions of the legitimacy or otherwise of the government, and so on. John Stuart Mill, famous 19th century liberal thinker, was an uninhibited advocate of self-determination, except for the people of India. He worked for the East India Company, and it's one of those paradoxes of liberalism that is hard to understand by today's standards, that he could have been working for the East India Company by day and by night writing important books on liberalism. But stranger things have happened in the world of political theory, believe me. And he advocated self-determination, but then there was a but. This was in his famous work on considerations on representative government. And he said, but when a people are ripe for free institutions, there is still one more vital consideration. Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities. Of course, that's been a problem with democratic systems in many countries and, of course, in many post-colonial states. And let me here confess to an experience I had which influenced my view on this very question of going to the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as it was called, in the early 1970s to do some research. I was actually researching Yugoslav defense policy. But the constitution was being rewritten at the time, and it was a constitution which had elements of liberty, freedom of elections and so on, but a lot of elements of repression. And I asked a lot of people what they thought of this. And the answer was always that there is still a terrible legacy of distrust and hatred between different peoples of Yugoslavia. And we need somebody with autocratic powers to keep the lid on the pan. And one has to say that those fears were not misplaced. It was precisely when Yugoslavia adopted completely free elections in 1991 that the country broke up. In those elections, every single party competing represented an ethnic or religious group. And the democracy was a recipe for division. And so I always had in my mind, not that autocracy is a good thing or is a guarantee against trouble, but that sometimes it can exist for quite solid reasons. Now, I could go on about the limits of the democracy versus dictatorship view of the world. I'll just say that think of the number of wars that have been defined and indeed have largely been about struggling to preserve a democracy in a country where it was under threat. And it's not a very glorious collection of wars from the Western point of view. Among them are, of course, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. I could go on, but you get the message that there are inherent limitations to waging wars to defend nascent democracies when they are in unpromising situations. And the third general point I would make is we have to note that threats to democracy today and forms of authoritarian rule are both changing. And the subject under discussion may be very different from our traditional view of autocracy, associating it with totalitarian rule of a single party. The forms of authoritarian rule today are extraordinarily varied, and they've included open espousal of illiberal democracy by Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary. And just this week, in fact, in the last 72 hours, his government has put a direct threat in the way of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and is threatening not merely to control their activities, but to seize their property. The spread of illiberalism in Central Europe is a worrying and strong phenomenon. And in the Philippines, a very different form of illiberalism with the extrajudicial killings of drug dealers and other criminals. And these illustrate hugely different attitudes of some of the illiberal rulers of today to important issues, including the issue of public violence and torture. Here are some of a list of features one could draw from new-style authoritarian regimes today. they have a strong emphasis on nationalism and on pursuit of the national interest. Secondly, they have a heavy reliance on populist slogans and rhetoric. Thirdly, there's the absence that I already mentioned of any fully developed ideology. I'm not sure that's a reassuring point, by the way. Fourthly, they do often generally allow the holding of periodic elections, but with varying practices about the fairness or otherwise of the conditions of different parties competing in the elections, and very different policies on the fairness of media coverage and on the acceptance of international election observers. A curious feature of many of these modern dictatorships is that there is still freedom of citizens to travel, work and study abroad. And that was actually, interestingly, a phenomenon in Yugoslavia in the 1950s and 60s, that many Yugoslavs went abroad, particularly to work. There's a mixture in these modern dictatorships of attempts to control domestic and international information flows and accept the continued existence of different information systems still on the other. There's not a complete totalitarian monopoly on news, but there is a very heavy influence in that area. Then there's a hostility towards acceptance of large numbers of refugees. That's something that cuts across many of these regimes. And suspicion of many political and social activities that are believed to be foreign funded or foreign inspired. And the last feature I would mention, I'm sure we could think of others, is that most of these states, despite railing against international organizations, continue to be members of them. They may combine it with high-profile criticism of some of them, but it doesn't often add up to a complete rejection. And occasionally attempts are made to get unions of autocratic states to league together to increase the effectiveness of their policies. But these attempts have not, on the whole, been very successful. President Duterte of the Philippines has threatened to withdraw Philippines from the United Nations and to set up a new organization with China and various African states. But there's absolutely no sign that it's happening. It's just another idea off the top of his head. Now, the last point I'd make, just as a general point, before getting on to the Arab Spring, is about civil, in other words, non-violent forms of resistance. And it's a very odd feature of the politics of our times that there has been a series of efforts to depict popular resistance as foreign-inspired, as the tools of imperialism. I've tried to trace this back. There was a famous speech by the East German communist leader in 1968, in which he justified the invasion of Czechoslovakia as a response to the various forms and methods of the imperialist policy of expansion. And he claimed repeatedly that there had been a Western plot for a non-violent uprising. After the fall of the Soviet Union, which itself was interpreted by some as part of a Western plot, there was a tendency in Russia to attribute certain color revolutions, Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, and Ukraine in 2004, to attribute them to malign Western influences. And these themes would become even more prominent in the events triggered by the Arab Spring. So that's a feature of our times, that civil resistance has got caught up in a way that it wasn't previously, with great power rivalries. Now, the Arab Spring. This was the most significant collection of cases of civil resistance since the many cases in late 1989 and in the summer of 1990 in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And there's an excellent paper for this conference by Marina Ottaway in which she describes the effects of the various cases of the Arab Spring resistance. They included, on the positive side, a long, difficult, and remarkably successful process of constitutional change in Tunisia. And I'll mention a bit more about that in a moment. But on the negative side, the consequences included a military intervention in Bahrain to maintain the existing system of government there, and the revival of an old authoritarian system in Egypt, and internationalized civil wars in Yemen and Syria, and a complete state of anarchy, lack of central authority in Libya. It's a pretty grim tally, even if there are some positive aspects to it. There have incidentally also been a continuation of demands for reform in monarchical states, including Morocco and Jordan. And one of the interesting and odd features of modern political life is that whereas in the 18th century, including when this Republic, the United States, was formed, monarchs were believed to be symbols of autocracy, the worst form of government that could be imagined. In the Arab Spring, the monarchies escaped relatively lightly compared with the dictators of a different kind, who indeed bothered their societies much more and generally were suspected by their populations of extreme cruelty, bribery, corruption, and what have you. There are some striking similarities between the movements that composed the Arab Spring. The early demands included calls for greater democracy, and these, of course, were problematic because of John Stuart Mill's problem of the difficulty of introducing democracy in a divided society. And this was pointed out by friendly critics, even at the time of the Arab Spring in 2011. Now, what lessons do we draw from the Arab Spring? I want first of all to mention, only to dismiss, 5 commonly drawn conclusions from the Arab Spring. The first is that Arab countries are unsuited to democracy and cannot make it work. And one finds that view even in a number of Arab countries. Secondly, almost identical theory, countries with Muslim populations are unsuited to democracy. Both of these theories involve racist caricatures and imply the general inferiority of the Arab world. Thirdly, civil resistance was the result of foreign influence, pressure, even conspiracy. This third lacks serious evidence and ignores the long record of civil resistance in the Arab world. Fourthly, civil resistance was a failure and is likely to be so in the future. Again, it ignores certain evidence, and not only of the evidence that I mentioned of Tunisia, but also the success of the revolution in Lebanon in 2005, known as the Cedar Revolution. And then fifthly, the conclusion is often drawn that the pursuit of power politics is simply a normal state of affairs and civil resistance cannot stop or even modify. Now, these broad generalizations all have the quality that they recognize the seriousness of the failures of the Arab Spring. And I'm in favor of recognizing that. But they are so broad brush and general as to make us blind to some important consequences that flowed from the Arab Spring. And I'm going to just offer 10 short propositions about the Arab Spring, which I think do hold water and are more convincing than the 5 that I've just treated rather dismissively. First conclusion, it is not only the skill of leaders and participants, but also conditions that are important in determining outcomes. That, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And within the circles of those with an interest in popular civil resistance, there has long been a debate about whether circumstances or individual factors are the most decisive. Now, clearly both are important, but the circumstances, the conditions, seem to me to be fundamental as demonstrated by the Arab Spring. Secondly, attempts to repress civil resistance campaigns may have different, even opposite, effects. And here particularly I'm thinking, first of all, of the effect of repression in some of the countries of the Arab Spring, where the effect was to increase the opposition, not to decrease it. And that, for example, in Egypt, the events began on National Police Day, when demonstrators were criticizing the reliance of the police on torture and the generally appalling character of the conduct. So it was very much a movement against repression. The same was true of the beginning of the revolution, which was the beginning of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And in both countries there were early attempts to repress the civil movement, and it sometimes slowed the momentum of demonstrations, but by no means always. What is true is that in Egypt in 2013, the use of harsh measures against any and all demonstrations did instill fear. One cannot deny that. And it's also true that in Bahrain, in the early months after the Saudi-led military intervention on the 14th of March 2011, the movements of demonstration against the regime did die down. And partly that was because of the extraordinary fear inspired by the complete destruction of the Pearl roundabout where they had had most of their demonstrations. Thirdly, the problem of creating a successor government in the wake of a fallen regime can lead to social disorder and even to war. One form of the succession problem is the power of the deep state to continue within the administration and the security services. Whole areas. So another problem is power vacuums in which whole areas of the state cease to be under state control because of the fall of the regime and become the playgrounds for drug traffickers, people traffickers, mercenaries, all sorts. There have been many cases of that in the wake of the Arab Spring. Now, it is true that theorists, or many theorists of nonviolent action, had emphasized that you should never think that a campaign is just about getting rid of a ruler. You have to think about the situation afterwards. Gene Sharp wrote that in 1993 in discussing the problem of military coups d'etats. He recognized that the planning for after a movement is as important as anything else. Fourth conclusion, constitutional democracy remains a principal means by which conflicts are played out with minimal violence. The movements of the Arab Spring generally called for an enhancement of democracy, and they particularly emphasized accountability in public life and better treatment of civilians. Interestingly, their focus was not on the traditional political issues of changing the colonial borders, the post-colonial borders of countries in the Middle East. Their focus was on good governance. But what they were not good at was coming up with convincing and detailed plans or participating in an organized manner in the planning for a new system of governance. And it may be that some civil resistance movements need to be much more explicit that their aim is to support constitutional systems of government. And they also have to be more explicit, I believe, in recognizing that one of the functions of government is to exercise the use of force to control territory, and that if you don't do that, you will have all the problems I just mentioned. That notion of a power vacuum, it doesn't have much place in the literature, but it does need to be frankly recognized. Fifthly, the characterization of existing rulers as dictators can be problematic. In the Arab Spring, there was a tendency to describe as dictators all of the leaders who were being opposed. While such attribution may have been justified in many cases, there are some problems associated with it. One is that some so-called dictators may in fact be rather weak and timid rulers who react to events just as much as any other government does. But a second and perhaps more worrying conclusion or consequence that follows from talking of all these rulers as dictators is it tends to support the lazy assumption that if only you get rid of the chains of a dictator, all will be well. And it's that lazy assumption that has been at the heart of a lot of Western thinking ever since Rousseau wrote the most brilliant introductory lines to any work of political theory, when he wrote literally the first lines of the Social Contract, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. That implication leads straight to Donald Rumsfeld and the invasion of Iraq. That belief that if only you can cut off the snake's head, as it were, all will be fine. It explains the lack of bothering to plan for the occupation phase or the future governance of Iraq. And I'm afraid there has been, as it were, a non-violent equivalent of that, in the belief that it is enough for a movement to shout, as they did in most of the Arab Spring countries, the people demand the fall of the regime. Maybe that's too simple a slogan. Sixthly, the movement's initial successes in overthrowing rulers in Tunisia and Egypt were misleading. They were misleading because in those countries where a regime was overthrown, building a constitutional order proved to be a very difficult question. And secondly, because in some countries, and most notably in Syria, the existing regimes had more sources of legitimacy than they had in Tunisia and Egypt. And so the idea that countries could fall like a row of dominoes was sadly misplaced. Seventhly, the decentralized and ad hoc character of the leadership of many of the movements in the Arab Spring hindered their performance, made it much more difficult, for example, for them to negotiate if you don't have a recognized leader. And think about the difference between Poland in 1989, where for the first time the astonishing event happened of a communist regime permitting more or less free elections and being voted out. Never happened in history before. People in the communist world thought it couldn't happen, and it did happen. That was the result of negotiations between very effective leaders of the Solidarity movement in Poland and representatives of the Communist Party leadership in the country. And it was that negotiation phase when compromises had to be made that was all important. And sadly, if you have a spontaneous movement with little in the way of organized leadership, and certainly little in the way of experienced organized leadership, that poses a problem. Eighthly, citizens can become weary of long, prolonged or repeated civil resistance campaigns. And that certainly happened in Egypt, for example. And ninthly, there's sometimes a tendency in civil resistance movements to treat the crowd as the fount of legitimacy. If a large number of people are demonstrating in a public square, demanding something, demanding even the fall of a regime, that's considered a basis for legitimacy. But of course, there's a problem there. Other people can organize rival demonstrations and did so in Egypt. So it's not good enough as a fount for legitimacy just to focus on a street period. The last conclusion I will draw is that international factors of various kinds played a limited part in influencing outcomes. I've noticed, including in the Arab world, a tendency to think that everything is an international conspiracy. I happen to have been tutored at Oxford by a famous historian, H.A.P. Taylor, who tended to believe that everything was the result of confusion and cock-up. And I actually think there's more to his theory than the conspiracy theory. But actually, the most significant change in the Arab Spring was the one that involved least external activity, and that was the change in Tunisia. It all happened so quickly, in a space of a very few weeks, and beginning in a very obscure and little-known part of the country, in the south, that the rest of the world knew little about it. And to this day, they're not even absolutely certain why the then ruler of Tunisia suddenly bunked off to Saudi Arabia. I should incidentally say that I spent a week in Tunisia last month, and it is very striking how in an undramatic way they are succeeding in running a constitutional democracy. And they have achieved the logically impossible feat of combining in a coalition government two parties that you might think were as different as oil and water. There's a Islamist party, Ennahda, which is founded on the idea of the significant influence of Islam in public life. And then there are various parties devoted to a secular outlook. And yet I've seen the politicians of the two parties working together, and it does work. And there is very little, there's some suspicion, of course, and bitterness, but it does work. So the explanation for why there's been that degree of success in Tunisia compared to what has been happening elsewhere is largely internal, not external. And the role of external powers in other cases has been highly problematic. The dithering of the West over Syria, the complete incapacity of the West to achieve anything serious in Libya, the failure, despite attempts on the UN and other bases to deal with it, failure to stop the civil war in Yemen from becoming an internationalized civil war, which it now is. It's a pretty grim record of international response, but an indication that outsiders aren't very good at controlling events. And if any outsiders have emerged with credit from the Arab Spring, and it's not exactly a form of credit I would cherish, it's Russia, which has at least shown a clarity of thought about what it wanted to achieve in Syria. And let me just here mention that both Syria, the government of Syria, and the government of Russia in the form of speeches by Vladimir Putin have articulated a very clear doctrine of civil resistance as being pernicious, foreign-inspired activity. And I recommend you to read these speeches by these two leaders as evidence of a view which is not backed up by any evidence. There's no precise line of explanation of how the West allegedly created these movements, but is very good at shedding suspicion. Now, I do not want to end by suggesting, and I'm about to end, but I do not want to end by suggesting that the Arab Spring is over, or that it was uniformly disastrous. It is not over. There are still some very interesting events going on. In Sudan, very widespread demonstrations, especially since last December, against the regime there, and we don't yet know the outcome of it, but it is striking how these demonstrations have lasted for a long time and have been widespread throughout the country and not merely in Khartoum. In other countries too, there have been significant developments. Take, for example, the case of Armenia, where there was an attempt by an individual to grab power and keep it for longer than his allotted number of terms, and that revolution, or that attempted coup, one should say, was effectively opposed largely by demonstrations in the streets of those who would not tolerate Parliament granting the additional powers that he sought. And very interestingly, this was an explicit case of civil resistance in support of constitutionalism. Now, there's lots more I could say about continuing activities, but I just want to mention one subject which I'm sure will come up again in the next few days, on which I did make some notes in my draft of these remarks, which is to do with our two countries, the United Kingdom and the United States. It will have occurred, I'm sure, to all of you that when I was talking of some of the features of new autocracies, that some of those features we can detect, sadly, in the politics of our own two countries. And it is an astonishing fact that two great English-speaking democracies that have been extraordinarily influential in the world for decades, even centuries, have run into trouble of various kinds. And some of the troubles are rather similar to what we have seen in the cases I've been talking about. For example, there is the extraordinary problem of politicians making proposals without having bothered to think through the detail of them. And whatever else one can accuse President Trump of, nobody has ever accused him of being excessively preoccupied with detail. In my own country, the advocates of Brexit have been astonishingly defective throughout in the matter of detail, of being precise about what they demanded. On the other hand, they, in both the United States and the United Kingdom, we still have democracies that function and are not under immediate threat. There may be some democratic rights that are under threat, but the biggest threat, I believe, and I will conclude on this, is the extraordinary way in which we have allowed information media of various kinds to peddle untruth and mischief on a grand scale, and to get away with it with apparently no consequences. I was so appalled by our own referendum campaign that I must confess that I decided I'd have to leave home with my daughter, who's a full-time election observer, and cycle across the country just to get out of the referendum out of our minds. And of course that failed completely, because when you cycle through rural areas, you're forcibly aware of how popular the Brexit cause was in rural areas. And I think that the House of Commons report last week, this week actually, on Monday, a House of Commons Committee on Culture, Media and Sport produced the longest and most thorough analysis of new media and their effect on elections, looking particularly at Britain, but not exclusively, and ended with a remarkable condemnation of what we have allowed to percolate into our political systems and leading to some very worrying outcomes. So I think the message of what I've got to say is that we need to put our own houses in order as much as worrying about other parts of the world. Thank you very much. Nathan. Indeed, yes.
I was interested in your new features of new autocracy and whether that requires new features or tactics of civil resistance. One feature I don't know that you mentioned was that the new popularity of autocrats, and that makes the reaction against their repression more difficult if they maintain a popularity, if they're able to identify the people they repress as enemies of the people. It seems to me that Putin and Erdogan, for example, has been able to get away with repressing protest almost completely, but and maintain popularity. So it seems like the dictators have been more interested and more successful in being popular. I know it seems that civil resistance has failed. Doesn't say it will fail in the future. So has war and guerrilla uprising. It's just a question about whether you see any reason for optimism that this new rise, unexpected rise in authoritarianism will meet some demise.
Well, I think we've already begun to see that in a number of ways, not least the congressional elections in the United States. And that's, to my mind, a very significant response. In Britain, there's been a slow, but glacially slow, change in public opinion, expressing nervousness about Brexit, and especially expressing nervousness about crashing out of the European Union with no agreement as to the terms. And who knows where that will lead in the next 4 or 5 weeks. It's going to be an interesting story to watch. But I do not rule out that the faults and weaknesses of whether the Trump administration or the pro-Brexit camp within the Conservative Party in the UK, I don't rule out that those faults and weaknesses will lead to resistance and opposition. I completely agree with you that one shouldn't regard civil resistance as being necessarily the main form of activity, or at least one shouldn't regard street demonstrations as being necessarily the main form of activity in response to every one of these crises. I remember I knew well one of Martin Luther King's close colleagues, Bayard Rustin, and who was a genius at organising protests, including the March on Washington. But he always said you should never do the same thing twice. You have to keep up, as it were, the imaginative momentum. And he was very good at that. And I think the same is true in Britain. For example, there will be another big demonstration against Brexit towards the end of next month in London. I'll probably be on it. But I don't regard that as the real work, the work that has to be done. The work that has to be done is in crafting, for example, the possible language of a referendum, if there is to be another referendum, on British membership of the European Union. Just as in the United States, an awful lot of the work is done in congressional committees, inquiries, and the lot. So one should not be obsessive, it seems to me, about civil resistance being the main form of activity. It has its place, undoubtedly. Yeah.
Just to push back a little bit, what about Central Europe? You mentioned in the Philippines, Duterte.
Yeah.
Wants to form a separate group with China and
Yeah.
I don't know how likely that is, but that wouldn't indicate a waning if so. Or, for example, Orban, who wants to sway the EU in the direction of right-wing politics. How real are these threats?
Well, there's no doubt that the threat in the European Union coming from a sort of newly recast, and in some ways interestingly recast, political right, is likely to have a major effect on the constitution of the European Parliament after the elections, which are coming up in May. And it looks likely that right-wing parties, which have been doing quite well in various countries, may actually form a majority in the European Parliament, or may be able to cobble together majorities with existing parties that are willing to cooperate with them. So that's entirely possible. And it's one of the worrying features of the European Union, and it explains partly the strength of the Brexit movement, that there is such disagreement in Europe on quite fundamental issues, including the issue of refugees. And it is striking how the issue of refugees has been at the heart of a lot of these problems. And not just, and that of course is in itself one of the consequences of the Arab Spring in Europe, that's been the source of a large part of the flood of refugees. And I have to say here that I think one of the really difficult issues with refugees is the issue of how to frame the debate and discussion about it. And in Britain we've had a disastrous way of framing the debate, which is for the government to respond by promising the public numerical limits on the number of refugees. Now, for various complicated reasons, the government has almost no control over the numerical limits. So they're on a hiding to nothing when they proclaim numerical limits, and then they consistently fail on them. And that sense of migrant flows being out of control is what has contributed to the political crises in many European countries, including in Britain. Now, I actually think we've done some willfully stupid things in contributing to that sense of the issue being out of control. Let me just give you just one example. The British government insisted for years and years, and still does, that all foreign students registering at British universities count as foreign immigrants. And needless to say, since we have successful universities that are in great demand, not least because of the English language and so on, we get a reflection of that success in a large number of applicants who pay good fees to study in Britain. Now, the minister in charge of that policy, who insisted on not altering it, and I have to tell you, when I was working at the British Academy, we made many attempts to persuade government that it was not sensible to treat foreign students who are just here for 3 years and in almost all cases go back home. It wasn't sensible to classify them as migrants. But the Home Secretary, Theresa May, now Prime Minister, would not hear of it, and she deserves a Nobel Prize for obstinacy, as for different reasons as her rival Jeremy Corbyn. But that issue could have been handled in a much more intelligent way, as the Canadians have done, emphasising not numerical limits, but other types of limit, emphasising that the problem is capable of being controlled, emphasising the positive contribution that immigrants bring in many different ways, and so on and so forth. There are different ways of handling it, but I think the fear that dictated or influenced Theresa May in refusing to change the classification was the fear of the newspaper headline the next day, which would be government fiddles immigration statistics. That's what they were afraid of. And they do live in fear of the next newspaper headline in a way that I find troublesome and embarrassing. Yes, at the back.
So I'm wondering how the Arab Spring compares to the development of liberalism in the West, and whether kind of the comparison to 1848 is warranted, and what that could tell us about where it's headed next.
Yeah. It is a bit like the 1848 revolutions, the springtime of nations, as it was called. And the Arab Spring conveys that same sense, just as the springtime of nations did, of a moment that cannot last. Now, I think that the 1848 revolutions had that quality, which was also evident in the Arab Spring, but they weren't able, alas, to realise it very much, that quality of, in many cases, seeking what were essentially constitutional revolutions. Revolutions not in order to create an entirely new world, another French Revolution all over again. Europe had somehow been inoculated against that, and hence the 1848 revolutions tended to be more cautious in their demands. And the Arab Spring revolutions were initially cautious in their demands, but as I indicated, insufficiently clear and precise and insufficiently organised. Some of them were aware of the similarities, and I think there is a civilizational element. I was struck by it in Tunisia last month. That sense of being deeply influenced by the proximity of France and of European civilization is particularly strong in Tunisia. One can find it elsewhere, like in Lebanon, for example, obviously. But it's particularly strong in Tunisia. And I found it interesting that some of the political leaders who are now running the country, including some from the Islamic Party, had been exiled in the 1990s, mainly in France, some in the UK, and they had rethought their politics in the context of living in exile and watching the political systems of the countries where they were exiled. And they were clearly very influenced by that. And above all, it was, I think, fear that they had suddenly found they were all alone, that others, when the regime tried to repress the Islamic elements in Tunisian society, that they found that they didn't have many friends to defend them when they were imprisoned and tortured and so on. It made them aware that they had to change their politics and be more flexible. And ultimately, they had to do that most difficult of things, which is, and it is genuinely difficult for an Islamic party, they had to accept that if you lose an election, you lose an election. You're out of government, and they were very clear about that. And it's the absolutely fundamental rule of democratic politics. And it's that rule that has put people like me in a difficult position on Brexit, because the argument against is, well, they won the referendum, didn't they? And it's very difficult to deal with that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a problem. But so I think the answer is that there was a strong awareness of Europe in the Tunisian case that was highly influential. I think gentleman in front, yes.
Yeah. I may just be wrong in my impression, but I had the impression that the Arab Spring had very little effect in Algeria. And why was that? But Algeria is pretty repressive.
Yeah. The main reason why, it's a question I asked, and some of my colleagues who did a book on the Arab Spring were very interested in Algeria and have written about it. And the answer is memories of violence in Algeria in the 1990s. They do not want to go there again. That violent period of violent opposition and very violent government is something that they just do not want to repeat. And so they sort of sat it out in the Arab Spring. And interestingly, and this is another example of why it's too simple to view politics as being democracy versus autocracy. The Tunisians and the Algerians get on quite well now, and they need to, because there are a whole range of issues between them, a long common frontier. There's a lot of smuggling across the frontier. We could have bought petrol cheap from people who were selling it when we went to the far south of the country. You see trucks selling off petrol cheap. They have to put a cloth over your petrol cap. You're not using the American term, oil I should call it, but never mind. You had to put a cloth over it to filter out the grit. But you could buy petrol dirt cheap that had been smuggled in from Algeria. Now, that's a very small example that they know about, and it doesn't trouble them too much. But the obvious risk of terrorist groups occupying that space between Algeria and Tunisia makes them cooperate, and they do cooperate very effectively. And so seeing that story as part of a saga of democracy versus autocracy just doesn't really work. Yes?
You mentioned a number of common threads. You raised the issue of Yugoslavia and the reflection of difficulties there, and Vladimir Putin and taking advantage of the situation in Syria and the failure of international organizations. Did you ever look at whether a no-fly zone may have been established if NATO had come together, had the NATO countries done what I think Secretary of State Clinton was suggesting, which is to form up a no-fly zone? She used the example of the no-fly zone in Bosnia and how it had been effective there. Had a no-fly zone work, might we have avoided some of the catastrophic consequences in Syria and the immigration from Syria?
Well, as we know from the case of Bosnia, no-fly zones are not problem-free, but that doesn't mean to say they can't achieve anything. And their purpose in Bosnia was partly to limit the capacity of the better armed country involved in the dispute, which is Serbia, or its supporters in Bosnia-Herzegovina, to limit the powers. And also there needed to be some kind of control over the sky in order to enable supplies to go into Sarajevo and other besieged cities. And it's one of the sort of unsung stories of the Yugoslav war, that a lot was achieved there. There were problems, but a lot was achieved, including Sarajevo never went through the kind of horrible starvation that does sometimes accompany modern siege warfare.
And Russia didn't come in and support the Serbs?
No, exactly. All of that was the subject of some fairly effective big power diplomacy and cooperation in the UN Security Council. But to get to the question of of Syria, whether a no-fly zone could have worked there, the overwhelming argument for it was to do with refugees. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think it was the idea that a significant part of Syria could be kept safe for refugees, so they wouldn't end up in Turkey or wherever, was the purpose of it. And I thought it was actually the best idea that there was around at the time. But for whatever reasons, and I don't know all the reasons, it never got very far. And it was never near to being implemented, so far as I'm aware. Were you involved in any of the Yugoslav events?
I had friends who were involved in
Yeah.
Yugoslav events, and I knew that Secretary Clinton was trying to make the case inside the National Security Council that a no-fly zone might avoid,
Yeah.
might help us avoid the other, and might keep Russia out of Syria.
Hmm.
And had Russia, of course, come into the Serbs, it would have been, possibly would have been an entirely different situation.
Yeah. I think it was just a case where, sadly, Western countries, disillusioned with the consequences of their involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, just had no appetite for it, and that showed very clearly in the British Parliament's decision about Syria. So I think that it was, and that in turn influenced the US government. There was a reluctance to get involved in Syria if the UK would not be supporting the US. So I think that a lot of factors ended up producing that result. But I personally, my own view would have been that the no-fly zone could have worked, just as no-fly zones did achieve something over northern Iraq in the 1990s and up to 2003. They were not a complete failure, and it's one of the sadnesses of policy over Iraq that whole period was consigned to labelled a failure, and instead we got the larger failure that followed. Yes?
I wonder, from the perspective of the international human rights movement, what was really exciting and promising about the Arab Spring was the use of social media. Really one of the first times that social media as a tool had been used in that kind of context. I wonder what sense of that you make as an historian. What are we to learn from that? Is there something
Yeah.
to learn?
Years ago, I did some research on the interesting revolt in French Algeria when four generals declared a sort of UDI, unilateral declaration of independence, and proclaimed that Algeria was permanently French and they were not going to tolerate any negotiation with the nationalists, the Algerian nationalists. And famously, de Gaulle initiated a popular resistance against the action of these four generals by calling on them to refuse to take part in military operations and to resist any orders from these four generals who'd been acting illegally. An interesting case of a constitutional government using civil resistance as its defence against a coup d'etat. Now, that was often called the revolution of the transistors, because the transistor radio had just been invented. All the French soldiers had transistors, and so de Gaulle could speak directly to them, even if they were in some remote location, in no mains power, far from any newspaper or anything like that. They could still get the news. So there's no doubt that news has a phenomenal, and the means of communicating information have phenomenal influence. And that was widely seen as part of the story of some of the colour revolutions in Georgia and in Serbia and Ukraine. In all of them, there was an element of early use of internet, etc. So it's been very important, but I have to say, I was always a skeptic that the results, the effect of the new media would all pan out on one side and not on the other side. And there were many people. There was a famous book written by one of the leaders of the Egyptian revolution called, I think, Revolution 2.0 or something, about how the new media made completely new forms of resistance possible, made popular resistance. And I fear that what we have seen is a move by governments and by all sorts of corporations and other bodies to use new media for purposes that I have to say I regard as antisocial. And there was a great deal of that in the UK referendum and has been exposed in a number of public media, and the company that was responsible for a lot of it, Cambridge Analytica, has gone bust, I'm delighted to say. So the evidence seems to be that the new media are actually quite neutral, especially at a time when there's been no serious attempt by any of the leading democracies to bring the new media under serious control. And I think that is bound now to follow. I think it's something that will gather momentum in Britain and the United States and and in Europe, and the laws that are adopted there will have a knock-on effect elsewhere.
The quite pernicious use of Twitter by one particular Twitter user here in the United States suggests that, yeah, social media has a downside as well as an upside.
Yes, yes. I have to say that I do regard it as unpresidential behaviour. Yes.
Kind of a related question. How would you grade, I guess, the importance to the control of information or the co-optation of information in media channels to, on the one hand, the success of popular resistance, but then on the other hand, to the resiliency of authoritarian regimes?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question.
So I'm asking, how would you grade the importance? Would you consider this to be something that would be extremely important to the success of popular resistance? The control of information and the control or co-optation of media channels, channels of communication? But I'm interested to get your take on how important it is for popular resistance movements,
Yes.
as well as for the resiliency of authoritarian regimes.
I think it is hugely important, but these things play out in quite complicated ways. And let me give you just one example from the UK. The BBC, being funded by the taxpayers, by people who pay for their TV licenses in the UK, has a sort of obligation to be politically neutral and to be completely fair and factual in its reporting. And I personally think that's a very good thing. I don't have any problem with that obligation. But as with all forms of neutrality, that poses a problem. What if you're being neutral between truth and a lie? And this problem arose repeatedly in the referendum campaign, where there were huge advertising campaigns and posters and messages text messages of all kinds, saying that Turkey was about to join the European Union, and that would mean that 90 million Turks would be coming to live in England. An outrageous proposition at all stages. Yet the BBC sort of treated it as if That was one point of view. And then another would be another point of view, and you had to balance them, when in fact one was just a complete invention. It's a very tricky issue, that. If you asked me to grade the importance of information, I would say it's not just a matter of information. It is a matter of being able to convey a vision. And it's not just a matter of facts. And one of the problems of the United States and the United Kingdom is that sometimes a sort of harking back to a better past vision, however incoherent it may be, has an appeal which mere facts cannot undermine. And sometimes there's been a failure to have a rival vision. In the case of the European referendum, there was much emphasis on we'll be worse off if we leave the European Union, much emphasis on the sort of economic side of the debate. But there was no mention of one of the fundamental reasons why the European Union had been brought into existence, and with the strong support of Winston Churchill, I might add, which was to reduce the danger of war in Europe. And that remains an important object of the European Union. So it's not just a matter of quantity of information or type of information, at least type of information communication. It's also a matter of thinking through what actually is a convincing message, and I'm afraid that we haven't been very good at that.